Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We continue today on book 5 on the continuation of justice, and we're looking at chapter 9 today, which deals with the question of suffering or doing injustice. Okay, so let's turn to the text. But if what concerns the suffering and the doing of injustice has been adequately defined, some might be perplexed, right? So even if it has been concerning suffering and doing injustice has been defined, but some can be perplexed. First, as to whether it is as Euripides said, putting it oddly, I killed my mother, brief is my speech. You voluntarily and she voluntarily, or she not voluntarily and you voluntarily. Now, 39. This passage is from Euripides' lost play, The Alcmaeon. The Alcmaeon. Now, at 11:10 to A28, where Aristotle alludes to the same play, again, see also that place where he does again. Bywater amends the text here by adding the negative in the last line. As Bernard notes, the sense seems to require the antithesis of hikusan, voluntary, in the previous phrase, right? So therefore, it's the opposition. We don't know, since we don't have the play. We don't know whether this is correct. We don't know the real things. I killed my mother. Brief is my speech. You voluntarily, she voluntarily, or you, she, or she not involuntarily, not voluntary, and you not voluntary, right? In other words, you killed each other. I killed my mother, right? But it is truly possible to suffer injustice voluntarily, for it is truly possible to suffer injustice voluntarily, or is it not, rather entirely involuntarily? Just as the doing of injustice is entirely voluntary in that sense. So the question is is there blame? The question is the suffering of injustice, the doing of injustice? Well, there is voluntary and involuntary. Well, how about the suffering of injustice, the voluntary and involuntary in that sense, right? Is it truly possible to suffer injustice voluntary, or is it not, rather entirely involuntary? Just as doing injustice is entirely voluntary, the argument is, right? Um, but then again, it is in fact suffering injustice either one way or the other, entirely voluntary or entirely involuntary. Again, Bywater brackets here phrase. Bywater has a bracket here, just as the doing of injustice is entirely voluntary. That appears to be repeated from the previous line. So the question is, he doesn't put it here. So, in other words, is in fact suffering injustice either one way or the other, entirely voluntary or involuntary? Or is it sometimes voluntary and sometimes involuntary? Right? So the question here becomes, is sometimes voluntary and involuntary? Is it just entirely voluntary or involuntary? So it's always voluntary and involuntary, but is it sometimes voluntary and sometimes involuntary? Similarly, too, is the case of being treated justly. For performing a just act is entirely voluntary, just as performing an unjust act is entirely voluntary, right? So doing a just, you're performing, you're going to do something, you're doing an unjust act intentionally. This is a choice. It is voluntary, right? So therefore, this is the case of a voluntary act. As a result, it is reasonable for there to be a similar opposition in each case. And so, for suffering injustice and being treated justly, to be either entirely voluntary or entirely involuntary, right? Yet it would seem to be strange in the case of being treated justly, if that is, being treated justly were entirely voluntary. Some who are treated justly do not submit to it voluntarily, right? The idea is that if you're being treated justly, it's strange that they would not submit to being treated justly. Some people, if you're treating them justly, it's strange that some people may not want to be treated justly, right? That's interesting. So it's a strange problem. So it is true that there's going to be this problem, the unjustly in both voluntary and involuntary, and justice voluntary and involuntary. So therefore, the question is that you're going to receive a justice. It seems that the doing of it is voluntary, but the receiving of it seems strange that one would not. If you're doing justice and doing that, why would someone not want to have it done to them? Right? Yet someone might be perplexed also about this, whether someone who has suffered something unjust always thereby suffers injustice, or whether what pertains in each case of doing pertains also in the case of the suffering. So in other words, this is that interesting thing. That is, they suffer an injustice, something that we consider injustice, but suffered something unjust always thereby suffers injustice. So something that we consider unjust, right? But is whether everyone who has suffered something unjust is always suffering injustice, or whether what pertains in the case of the doing pertains in the case of the doing pertains also in the case of the suffering, right? For it is possible, for it is possible in the case of both doing and suffering to share incidentally in just things. In other words, accidentally in that sense, incidentally. In other words, you can doing and suffering, you can get something like something that you unintentionally get injustice. Okay, incidentally, by accident, you get something just, unjust things. Similarly, it is clear that this is also possible in the case of unjust things. For to do unjust things is not the same as to be unjust. To suffer unjust things is not the same as to suffer injustice. And similarly, also in the case of performing a just act and being treated justly. Okay, in other words, I can do a just act, but is the person being treated justly? So therefore, this is a very interesting point he raises here, that you can that sometimes we can get things. We can, in other words, so, in the case of both in the case of both doing and suffering, doing something and suffering, you can share accidentally in something. Just, he talks about the just things. And clear, it is also possible in the case of unjust things, right? For to do unjust things is not the same to be unjust. And to suffer unjust things is not the same as to suffer injustice. And simultaneously, also in the case of performing just acts and being treated justly. In other words, someone can perform this, and that you still may not be a just act has been done to you, but you don't think you were treated justly. For it is impossible to suffer injustice if another does not do an injustice. Well, so you can't. In other words, in other words, you cannot suffer injustice if one does not do injustice, or to be treated justly if another person does not do something just. So, in other words, if I'm not doing what is just, if this is not just, then you're not suffering an injustice, even though the thing that is done is just. Same thing. If I'm not doing this by choice or voluntarily, not by choice, non-choice, but voluntarily. If I do this voluntarily, then, but if I don't do this voluntarily, not if I don't do this, if this not, therefore it requires it's just or unjust only if I do it voluntarily. I choose to do it, right? Then if I don't, Therefore, it is not the act done is not just. Now, even though the thing itself on its own terms may be a harm and therefore perceived as just, or a benefit that perceived as just, right? But it is not, the action itself is not just injustice, because of the choice of the attitude, it seems to be he's saying, right? Um, Also, in the case of a just act being done justly, for it's impossible to suffer injustice if another does not do an injustice, and to be treated justly if the other person does not do something unjust. If to do injustice is simply to harm someone voluntarily, and the person who acts voluntarily knows whom he's harming, with what and in what manner, and the person who lacks self-restraint harms himself voluntarily, then in that case he would do injustice involuntarily, and it would be possible for him to do injustice to himself, right? This is that, but then again, we can't really do just, in other words, we don't. In other words, without self-restraints, can harms himself voluntarily. Then, in that case, he would do injustice voluntarily, and it would be possible for him to do injustice to himself. Very interesting thing, right? So this is that weird moment of here, or the problem here, and this too is one of the perplexing questions: whether it is possible for someone to do injustice to himself. Further, there is a perplexity to whether someone, on account of his lack of self restraint, could be harmed voluntarily by another who acts voluntarily, such that it would be possible for him to suffer injustice voluntarily. So that he's lack of, because someone, further, as perplexity is whether someone, on account of their self restraint, could be harmed voluntarily by another who acts voluntarily. So I don't have self restraint, and because of that I am harmed. But it's something I could control, right? In that sense, it's not external to me. And then, and the person who harmed me did so by choice, uh, such that it could be possible for him to suffer justice involuntarily. To suffer justice voluntarily. Or is the definition not correct? And one must, and must, and in other words, or is the definition not correct? And must one rather add by to doing harm knowingly to whom, with what, and in what manner, the phrase against the wish, the other's wish. In other words, that's so. Therefore, instead of saying knowingly or involuntary, voluntary, against the other's wish. So he seems to suggest that no, that's corrected here. This thing is perplexing, but if I add this, or should I say, instead of, or is the definition not correct? One must add to the phrase "doing harm knowing to whom," and with with what and what manner, the phrase "against the other's wish." Someone is harmed voluntarily and suffers unjust things, then, but no one voluntarily suffers injustice. No one voluntarily suffers injustice, for no one wishes for this, not even the person lacking self-restraint. So therefore, this is why there's no you cannot suffer unjust things voluntarily. That is not rational. In other words, no one would rationally do this. You'd have to be mad to do this, the argument is. So no one of sane mind wishes for this, not even a person lacking self-restraint. Rather, he acts against his own wish. In other words, he acts against his own wish. For no one wishes for what he supposes not to be of serious worth, spudaios value. worth. And the person lacking self-restraint supposes that he ought not to do what he proceeds to do. So therefore, the person lacking self-restraint knows that he should not do this. He ought not to do what he then does. He knows it's wrong, but he does it. So in one way, he knows it's wrong. It's not out of ignorance, but lack of self-restraint, and therefore it is voluntary in a sense, right? The person who gives away his own things, just as Homer asserts that Glaucus did to Diomedes, gold for bronze, the worth of 100 cattle for 9, does not suffer injustice. Again, this is Iliad, book 6, right? The one who knowing, the person who gives away his own thing, gold for bronze and the worth of 100 things, does not suffer injustice. For the giving is up to him, but suffering injustice is not up to him. Rather, there must be someone who commits injustice. In other words, there must be someone who's committing injustice. If I do that, I'm just out of ignorance. I'm doing it either I do it willingly or out of ignorance or out of deception to myself. I'm not. This is not ignorance. Now, am I lying to you? If I make a bad judgment, this is not injustice. If I make a bad choice, I make a bad decision, I make a bad act. Yeah, this is bad, but it's not unjust. I suffer a harm, but it's not an unjust harm in that sense. It's that you did it. For the giving is up to him, but the suffering injustice is not up to him. Rather, there must be someone who commits injustice. As for the suffering injustice, then, it is clear that it is not voluntary. You don't volunteer. If something does injustice to you, you don't choose to have it done to you. Of the things we choose to speak of, to remain. So of the things we choose to speak of, to remain. Whether he who distributes more than is merited is ever unjust, or whether the unjust person is the one who receives the greater share. So the first question is two issues: whether he who distributes more than his merit is unjust, or whether the unjust person is the one who receives the greater share. And whether it is possible for someone to do injustice to himself. So these are the two things that remain. So whether he who distributes more than himself than what is merited is unjust, and whether the unjust person, is one who receives the greater share, right? Um, for if the first statement is possible, and he who distributes what is more than is merited does injustice, but not he who receives it. Then if someone knowingly and voluntarily distributes more of his own things to another person, this person does injustice to himself, which is the very thing that those of a measured disposition are held to do, since the decent person is disposed to take less for himself, right? So therefore, this idea that that's a weird thing. This is the problem. This is why this is interesting. He says, so therefore, in other words, he who distributes more than he does than his merit does injustice, but he does not. But he who receives it. So the problem then is this, right? And is it possible to do harm to oneself, right? And he goes, then if someone knowingly and voluntarily distributes more of his own things, this person does injustice to himself, which is the very thing that those in measured dispositions, those those gentlemen, right? The gentle people are held to do, since the decent person is disposed to take less for himself. Or is this not even, or is not even this a simple thing? For as it happens, the decent person is grasping for more than his share of another's good. In other words, the decent person is grasping for more than his share of another's good. For example, a reputation, or what is unqualifiedly noble. In other words, does he, okay, he gives away his goods, but he wants what? More of honor, the noble things, the unqualifiedly noble, a reputation. In other words, he does this for reputation. So then is that a good? In other words, so this is why it's complex. He says, for even this, he said, one level, it would be harming himself, but this is, by the way, this is what we expect. This is what the decent person does. He gives more than takes away from himself. So he gives the example of giving more than what merits. Now, the question of more than what merits may be of other people's things, not of your things. That may be the issue where it becomes more clear. But of your own things, because the problem here is the question of one's own, harming oneself. So I'm giving more than I should. Am I harming myself? Because I the question is, this is what noble people do. These refined, measured disposition, right? But the problem with this is that may not be complex because yes, I may be giving more material goods, but I may be grasping for more than I should in returns of the noble things. For example, of another good, right? A reputation, or of what is unqualifiedly kalos, noble and beautiful. Further, this perplexity is resolved by referring to what is distinguished. This perplexity is resolved by referring to what distinguished the doing of injustice. For whoever gives more of his own goods than is merited suffers nothing contrary to his own wish. He wishes to do this, so he's not suffering contrary to his own wish. The result is that he does not suffer injustice on this account, at least. But he suffers. But if he suffers anything at all, it is only harm. So the question of harm versus injustice. So I may suffer harm, but it's not. I don't suffer injustice. But it is manifest too that he who distributes more than is merited does injustice, though not always he who receives more. So it is manifest too that he who distributes more than what is merited does injustice. But what is unjust belongs not to the person who simply does injustice, but to the one who does it voluntarily. So what is unjust belongs to the person not only simply does injustice, but one who does it voluntarily. This rests in him who is the origin of the action, which is the person who distributes, but not the one who receives. The receiver is not the one who committing an injustice. The question is, but wait a minute, unless he knows it's done, what is being given is unjustly given, or not necessarily given, but taken from someone else, and you know that this is the stolen goods problem, right? But the idea is that, okay, you get more. I've given more to you. That's not, you're not doing injustice. It's the one who gives more is the one who's doing injustice. And if he does so voluntarily, then there's clearly an unjust act. And the injustice is not you taking the more, but that he distributed more than what should have been done. And the one who gives, who distributes, but not the one who receives. Further, since to do, posen, poisen, to do, is spoken of in many ways. To do is spoken in many ways, and it is possible for inanimate things to kill. So therefore, to do inanimate things to kill. Also, for a hand and a house slave, a worker or a house slave who is so commanded. So inanimate things, or maybe even for a hand or a house slave who has been commanded, the person who receives the greater share is not acting unjustly, though he does do unjust things. In other words, when he receives the greater share, he's not acting unjustly, but he does do unjust things. So the person who receives a greater share is not acting unjustly, though he does do an unjust thing. Further, if the distributor judged in ignorance, he does not do injustice according to what is legally just, and neither is his judgment unjust, though it is in a sense unjust. In other words, it's just by nature. It's unjust simply. There is, in a sense, it's unjust. It's not legally unjust. It's not legally just, and there is his judgment, even though in a sense it's unjust because it's unequitable. What is legally just is different from what is just in the primary sense. So there's a distinction. What is legally just versus what is just are different in the primary sense. But if he judged unjustly while recognizing this fact, then he himself too is grasping for more, either of gratitude or of vengeance. So therefore, if I judge unjustly and I recognize that I'm doing this, and I'm not doing it from error, then I am grasping for more, either out of gratitude, trying to get people's gratitude, or vengeance. Just as if then someone should receive a share of an unjust distribution, so too he who judges unjustly because of these things, gratitude and vengeance, receives more than his share. For if he were to make a judgment about land on this basis, he would not take. Then he would not. Sorry. Then he would take not land but money. If he were to make a judgment about land on this basis, he would not take land, but he would actually take money in that sense, right? So in other words, he's doing something unjust in that sense. Distribute land. In other words, for he were to make a judgment about land on this basis, he would not be taking the land, but he'd be taking money. So that's injustice. Human beings suppose that doing injustice is up to them, and hence also that what is just is easy. So therefore, people suppose that doing injustice is up to them. So this is supposition, and hence also what is just is easy, but it's not. Both cases is not. It's neither. Sometimes we do injustice not by choice. We do injustice not through choice and not voluntarily. It's not up. It is not up to them. And two, because we can have unjust things done to us or forced upon us. And then the other thing is, it's not sometimes being just is not easy. It's hard. For to have intercourse with a neighbor's wife, to strike someone nearby, and to put money into someone's hands is, they suppose, easy and up to them. But to do these things while being in a certain state is neither easy nor up to them. Okay, right? In other words, these things in themselves seem easy, but if you're in a certain state, in other words, but to do these things while in a certain state is neither easy nor necessary up to them. They wouldn't choose to do so if they have choice. Similarly, too, people suppose that to know the just and the unjust things is in no way to be wise. People suppose that to know the just and unjust thing is in no way to be wise, because it is not difficult to comprehend what the laws says. But these are not the unjust things, except incidentally. In other words, what the law says It's not difficult to comprehend with the law. But these are not the law themselves. The laws are not the but the laws are not the just things simply, not except incidentally by accident in terms of the best regime. In other words, the question of the regime that every regime. What the law says, the law is not necessarily what the just is. The law is what the state, the society, the regime in question thinks is just. But unless that regime is the best regime, then there is a gap between what is best and what is just and what that regime says is best. Let's continue. But how the just things are done and how they are distributed, this is indeed a greater task than to know what is conductive to health. Since even here, to know about honey, wine, hellebore, cauterizing, and cutting is easy, but to know how to administer them with a view to health and to whom and when is a great task, is as great a task as to be a physician, right? So therefore, this is the problem of justice. Justice is difficult. Justice is, in other words, the physician. In other words, knowing certain things doesn't make you, but know when to do them and in what cases you shouldn't do them. This requires a skill. This is a technique, and this is a kind of wisdom. This is one of the forms of kind of wisdom in that sense. Techne is a kind of knowing, a correct, truthful knowing, and knowing not. Okay, when something you should do or shouldn't do, and how you should do it. Right? It's a knowing. This is a kind of wisdom in that sense. And there is a wisdom in this. This is not wisdom in the complete sense, but there is a wisdom in the particular sense of the act of the craft or the art. So to injustice. So justice is a kind of requires a wisdom, a knowing about what the just and unjust are, and this is not simple. The argument is it is as difficult as the physician, maybe even more than the physician. On account of this very thing, too, people suppose that doing injustice belongs no less. In other words, that people suppose that doing injustice belongs no less to the just person than to the unjust, because the just person would be no less able, but even more able to act both justly and unjustly. So, therefore, the idea here is that they believe that the unjust person knows how to act unjustly. So, most people, in other words, on account of this very thing, the belief that it's easy, that the just person that doing injustice belongs no less to the just person than to the unjust. In other words, because the just person would be no less able to act both justly and unjustly, for he could, they suppose, have intercourse with another's wife and strike another, and the courageous man could throw down his shield and turn every which way, run in whatever direction. But being a coward or doing injustice is not doing these things except incidentally, but rather doing them when one is in a certain state. Just as being a doctor or healing someone does not consist in cutting or not cutting someone, but prescribing drugs or not prescribing them, but doing these in a certain way. So, in other words, I'm doing it. In other words, being a doctor is not cutting somebody or giving them a drug or like that. It is knowing knowing what needs to be done and doing what needs to be done. The courageous man is not someone. In other words, the just man is not someone. In other words, the courageous man is not the person who's going to run. It's that he knows what is to be done. He does what is. He stays and fights rather than runs. Right? Now, a courageous man may also run, but that's because the reason tells him to run in that sense. Because to stay is not wise. In other words, not every running is an act of cowardice. In that sense, this is what he's saying here. It's not this, and therefore justice in this sense He, he uses the metaphor of justice and doing, but being a coward or doing injustice is not doing these things, except in the sense of they're doing it in the incident of this incident, right? In this case, but rather doing them when one is in a certain state, that they're doing it of a deliberative sense. You're doing this out of choice. You're doing this out of a decision knowingly. Like the doctor does this knowingly. He's not, I'm cutting, I'm doing that. He knows that he needs to do this. His knowledge of health, the human body, and what is conducive to health and what is not conducive to health leads him to say this needs to be done to get that. He he not only wishes good, he knows what is needed to. His knowledge, he has wisdom, and he has knowledge of what needs to be done. Here, the just man in this case knows that he knows what needs to be done. It's not about he knows how to be bad. No, he knows what is the just. It's not this. This is we suppose that he can be the just man can be just as bad as the bad guy. No, he has not. In other words, the just man because he has justice. He would have to do it. In other words, he'd have to fight his own character in this sense. If someone was truly a just person, it would be very difficult for him to be unjust unless some passion or some act something that forces him to do against his nature, or he becomes corrupted by something and he ceases being just because of the corruption. Okay, this is what he talks about here. And the last paragraph here, the just things exists among those who share in the unqualifiedly good things. So the just things exist among those who share in the unqualifiedly good things and who have an excess or deficiency of them. So the just things exist among those who share in the unqualified good things and also and who have an excess or a deficiency of them. For some, there is no excess of these goods. For example, the gods. There is no excess of these goods. For example, the gods. Perhaps for others, for the incurably bad, or others, the incurably bad. They're bad and they cannot be. They're just bad. There is no beneficial portion of them, but all of them do harm. So the uncurably bad, there's no portion of this. You give these good things, these unqualifiedly good things, to them. It's not going to make them better. That, but no enough portion for them. But all of them do harm in that sense. Make it worse. Make him worse. Make that unjust person worse. And for still others, there is a beneficial portion up to a certain amount. There's others. You can give them some goods, these unqualifiedly good things, up to a certain amount, but after that it becomes bad for them. That's a Pareto optimality, right? That's this clause here. For some other, there's a beneficial portion up to a certain amount. That's Pareto's. We call diminishing marginal returns, right? Pareto. There's a Pareto point where you hit a point and then you don't get any higher benefit. In fact, you may even get diminishing returns, right? On account of this, justice is something human. Now, the reading of the manuscript, an ancient translation, however, suggests an original text that would read, hence this, the good, is something human. Burnett and others prefer this amended edition, since the text as it is has no express or even applied subject here, right? So therefore, this is the question. Some editions say they had hence this, on account of this, the good. But I think justice. I think he's right here. On account of this, justice is something human. Or the translation, Bernard, Bennett argues and others argue that the amended edition of saying, hence this, the good, is something human, the good. But on account of this, justice, the thing that was talked about, right, is something human. This is how he ends. Well, that's it. I hope we all have any comment. Any of you have any comments, questions, or issues that raised because of this chapter? Please put your questions or concerns or issues below, and I respond to them when I see them. If you've liked the chapter, hit the like button. Please hit the like button. It helps to what we've done here. It was important that people like it. If you've liked it, also share it with your friends, share it on social media, share it far and wide. It does help the algorithm if you do this. Another thing to do is if you've not subscribed, please subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. Please talk to others you know that may be interested in these things and get them to subscribe. It will help the channel. If you didn't like what I did here, you can always thumbs down. But say why in the comments. That way we can all learn from this. If you want to follow me on social media, the social media links are below. If you want to know more about me as a scholar and a researcher, and follow my research, you can do so through my academic social media links below my social media links. And then what you can do is also, if you want to help me to do what I do, you can do so through Subscribestar Patreon. Or if you also want, the way you can help is you can buy one of my books. The books are listed below. You can order them at your bookstore or through a bookseller, online bookseller like Amazon or Barnes and Noble. That's all it is. Next time we'll look at chapter 10. We have 2 more chapters, 11 chapters in book 5, and therefore next week is the penultimate chapter of book 5. So we will see you then the next time we see you. Take care. Bye-bye. Have a good day.